Unaware his wife was the $90 billion buyer his father was desperate to impress, he called her, just a receptionist. The exact moment my father called my wife, just a receptionist, I saw something in her eyes that terrified me. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply smiled, the same calm smile she wore whenever someone underestimated her. I had no idea that within the next hour, my father would discover he had just humiliated the only person who could save the company he'd spent 40 years building. And by then, it would already be too late. My name is Ethan, and I'm 37 years old. People always assumed I had an easy life because my father owned one of the largest industrial manufacturing companies in the state. The truth was very different. Growing up, my father never wanted a son. He wanted a successor. Every report card. Every baseball game. Every conversation. Felt like another performance review. If I scored 98, he'd ask why it wasn't 100. If I closed a small business deal after college, he'd ask why I wasn't negotiating international contracts. Nothing was ever enough. Eventually, I stopped trying to impress him. Instead of joining the family company immediately, I took a junior operations job at a logistics firm. That's where I met Grace. She worked at the front desk. Everyone called her the receptionist. She greeted visitors. Scheduled meetings. Remembered birthdays. Made nervous clients feel comfortable. Most people barely noticed her. I did. Because after every meeting ended, executives quietly asked Grace for advice before making decisions. At first, I thought they were just being friendly. Then I realized something strange. Whenever Grace suggested a change, profits mysteriously improved. Shipments arrived faster. Contracts closed more smoothly. She understood business better than most executives I'd ever met. One evening I finally asked, "Why are you working reception?" She smiled. "I like watching people before they know I'm watching." I laughed. "That's not really an answer. It will be someday." We fell in love slowly. She hated expensive gifts. Loved bookstores. Volunteered on weekends teaching financial literacy to teenagers. She never talked about her family. Whenever I asked, she'd simply say, "They value privacy." 3 years later, we got married. My father barely attended. During the reception he whispered, "You could have married someone useful." I ignored him. Grace squeezed my hand beneath the table. "It's okay." No. It wasn't. But she never complained. Years passed. My father's company began struggling. Cheap overseas competitors entered the market. Major contracts disappeared. Debt grew. Banks became nervous. Every family dinner turned into another discussion about survival. One Sunday Dad looked unusually hopeful. "We finally have a chance." "What happened?" "A global investment group wants to acquire us." I nodded. "That's good." He smiled proudly. "If this goes well, it'll be the biggest deal of my career." For weeks he obsessed over preparing. New presentations. Expensive suits. Luxury dinners. Every executive rehearsed speeches. He repeatedly reminded everyone, "This buyer controls over $90 billion in assets." The number sounded unreal. 90 billion. Dad spoke about the mysterious buyer like royalty. "They're sending a representative to evaluate us. No mistakes." The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. That same morning, Grace asked, "What time is your father's presentation?" 10. She looked at her watch. "I'll be a little late getting home tonight." I smiled. "Big day at work?" "You could say that." I kissed her goodbye. Neither of us knew how strange the day would become. Dad insisted I attend the presentation. When I arrived, executives rushed around nervously. Fresh flowers. Perfect lighting. Custom coffee service. Everything had to look flawless. At exactly 10 o'clock. A black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Everyone stood. A young assistant stepped inside. "We'll begin shortly." Dad whispered. "Where's the buyer?" "They're finishing another meeting." Minutes later. The conference room door opened again. I almost dropped my coffee. Grace walked in. Still wearing the same simple navy suit she'd left home in. Dad frowned. He looked annoyed. Then he snapped loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Excuse me." Grace stopped. "The reception area is downstairs." Several executives looked uncomfortable. Grace politely answered. "I'm actually here for the meeting." Dad laughed. "No offense. But this discussion involves billion-dollar decisions." He looked around the room. "We don't need someone's receptionist wandering in." The room became painfully quiet. I stood up. "Dad." He waved me off. Grace remained completely calm. "I'm not lost." Dad chuckled. "Then who exactly are you here with?" Before Grace could answer, the assistant spoke. "She's the buyer." Nobody moved. Dad blinked twice. "I'm sorry." The assistant repeated slowly. "Mrs. Grace Carter is the lead acquisition partner representing Blackstone Meridian Capital." The room went completely silent. My father actually laughed. "Very funny." The assistant didn't smile. She placed a leather folder on the table. Inside were authorization documents. Board approvals. Identity verification. Everything. Dad's face slowly lost all color. I stared at my wife. She looked at me almost apologetically. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you." I whispered. "You." She nodded. "My family's investment group." My brain couldn't process it. She wasn't a receptionist. She had never been. Grace quietly took the seat directly across from my father. The seat reserved for the buyer. Dad suddenly became incredibly polite. "Mrs. Carter." Grace interrupted gently. "Grace is fine." He forced an awkward smile. "I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding." She simply nodded. "Let's discuss your company." For the next 90 minutes, Grace asked precise questions. Not aggressive. Not emotional. Just brilliant. She knew production numbers without opening reports. She knew customer complaints before managers mentioned them. She even identified accounting errors the finance department had overlooked. Every executive became visibly nervous. Finally Dad asked, "What do you think?" Grace closed her notebook. "I think the company has excellent employees." She paused. "But weak leadership." Nobody breathed. Dad forced another smile. "I'm sure we can improve." Grace looked directly at him. "I agree." Then came the first twist. She slid a document across the table. "This is our acquisition proposal." Dad eagerly opened it. Then froze. It wasn't an offer to buy his company. It was an offer to buy every asset. Except executive leadership. His management team, including himself, would all be replaced. Dad looked horrified. "What?" Grace answered calmly. "Our analysis shows the business is valuable. Your leadership structure isn't." He slammed the papers shut. "You can't be serious." She quietly replied. "I've spent 3 years anonymously interviewing suppliers, employees, customers, and former executives." 3 years. I stared at her. She smiled softly. "I wasn't working reception to answer phones." I was conducting field research. Every memory suddenly made sense. The questions she asked after work. The notes she quietly wrote. The interest she showed in logistics and manufacturing. She hadn't been watching one company. She'd been studying an entire industry. Dad looked furious. This is personal. Grace shook her head. No. If it were personal, I would have left after you called me just a receptionist. The room remained silent. Then came the second twist. Grace opened another folder. I'm willing to keep one executive. Everyone looked at Dad. He smiled hopefully. Then she looked at me. Ethan. I stared at her. What? Our analysts unanimously recommended you. Dad's face turned pale. He's never even worked here. Grace smiled. No. But every former employee we interviewed mentioned one thing. She looked at me. They all said. If Ethan had been allowed to lead, they would have stayed. Dad whispered. Impossible. Grace slid another document toward him. Hundreds of anonymous employee interviews. Many dated years earlier. One repeated sentence appeared again and again. The wrong Carter inherited the power. My father couldn't speak. Not because Grace humiliated him. Because strangers had confirmed the fear he'd buried for years. He had spent his life preparing himself to lead forever. Instead of preparing someone else to lead better. The meeting ended quietly. No shouting. No revenge speech. Just silence. 2 weeks later. The board accepted Grace's proposal. Dad officially retired. Not because he wanted to. Because shareholders overwhelmingly approved the restructuring. Months later, he unexpectedly visited our home. He looked older. Smaller. He handed Grace a small gift. What is this? He smiled sadly. A nameplate. She opened the box. Inside was a polished brass plaque. It read. Grace Carter Executive Chair. Dad lowered his eyes. I spent years judging people by titles. You taught me titles mean nothing. Grace gently smiled. No. Character means everything. Later that evening, I asked her the question I'd carried since the meeting. Why didn't you tell me who you really were? She squeezed my hand. Because I needed to know. Whether someone could love me before they knew what I owned. I laughed quietly. You tested me. She smiled. A little. Worth $90 billion. She laughed for the first time all day. No. That company isn't mine. It's managed by my family. I just happen to be the one trusted to decide where it grows next. Years have passed since then. People still ask me what it felt like discovering my wife wasn't just a receptionist. I always give the same answer. They ask the wrong question. The real question isn't how wealthy she was. It's why everyone assumed the woman greeting visitors couldn't possibly be the smartest person in the room. My father learned that lesson in front of an entire boardroom. I learned it the day I first fell in love with her. The difference is, I never needed $90 billion to recognize her worth.